My name is Raymond Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and I live in a quiet town called Mill Haven, Tennessee. I'm a retired contractor. I spent 42 years building things with my hands: houses, commercial buildings, storage units, shopping strips, things built out of concrete, iron, and sweat, things that stand long after the man who built them is forgotten. I never went to college, never wore a tailored suit to work, never had a business card with a fancy corporate title. What I had was a work ethic my father carved into me, a set of second-hand tools I bought with my very first paycheck, and an unshakable belief: if you build something solid, it will take care of you long after you stop swinging the hammer. I have one son. His name is Garrett. He's 38 now, smart kid, got a business degree, works in corporate sales, makes good money, or at least he likes people to believe he does. 3 years ago, Garrett married a woman named Vanessa. From the very first minute I met Vanessa, I saw it. There was something behind her smile that didn't quite match her eyes, a cold, calculating arithmetic going on behind those polite nods. But she was my son's choice, so I kept my mouth shut and welcomed her. What I didn't expect was that Vanessa would spend the next 2 years making sure everyone in her orbit knew that I, Raymond Calloway, was nothing. A worn-out old handyman with dirt under his fingernails, an embarrassing relic of the past, a quiet burden to be tolerated. She said it with soft chuckles at Sunday dinners. She implied it over champagne at Christmas. She whispered it into my son's ear behind closed doors, and eventually, right in front of my face. She never once stopped to ask what those dirty hands had actually built. She never once thought to pull county records, and she certainly never looked up who actually owned the 6-story luxury apartment complex she called home. This is the story of what happened when she finally did. To understand the present, you have to understand who I was before Vanessa walked into our lives. My late wife, Patricia, used to say I was the quietest, successful man she'd ever met. I never needed applause. I never needed a luxury car to feel like a man. Patricia and I lived modestly, a sturdy 3-bedroom house on the edge of town, a used truck I drove for 12 years, and Sunday dinners for anyone who stopped by. We paid cash for Garrett's college. No loans, no debt. We just handled business and stayed silent. When Patricia passed 6 years ago from pancreatic cancer, she took a lot of the noise out of my world. The house got quieter. Garrett was busy building his career, dating, moving up the ladder. I didn't begrudge him. I kept working, kept managing my portfolio, kept showing up quietly. By that time, I owned 7 major commercial and residential properties, not mansions, but high-yield apartment complexes, an office park, and 2 residential developments. My accountant once looked over my balance sheets, shook his head, and said I was worth more than almost anyone in this county would ever guess just looking at my muddy work boots. I told him that was exactly how I intended to keep it. Then came Vanessa. Garrett met her at a corporate conference in Nashville. When he called me 2 weeks later, he sounded intoxicated. "Dad, she's incredible. Ambitious, polished, knows exactly what she wants out of life." The first time Garrett brought her over for dinner, I made sure the house was clean and cooked a decent meal. Vanessa arrived impeccably dressed, full of practiced poise. But right around her second glass of iced tea, her eyes swept over my living room, the modest furniture, my faded worn boots sitting by the mudroom door, the old framed photos. It was a subtle flicker in her eyes. Most people would have missed it. But I'd spent 42 years reading job sites, reading subcontractors, reading body language. I caught it instantly. It was the look of a woman who had just cataloged my entire worth and filed me away under irrelevant. And once Vanessa made up her mind about someone, she treated that judgment as gospel. The condescension started small, but it mutated quickly. When they got engaged, I bought them a generous cash gift and attended their engagement dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown. Vanessa's parents were there. Her mother Sandra, dressed for an opera, and her father Bruce, who shook my hand once with a limp grip and spent the night discussing stock options with Garrett. I sat at the edge of the table, sipping my water, watching. That's when the subtle stabs began. "Garrett, your father is just so rustic." Vanessa laughed softly to her mother, intentionally keeping her voice just loud enough for me to hear. "It's honestly sweet how comfortable he is staying in his little bubble." Sandra gave me a tight, pitying smile. Well, not everyone is wired for high ambitions, darling. I didn't flinch. I just took another sip of my drink. At 67, you don't waste energy defending yourself to people who have already drawn their little conclusions. You just wait. Over the next year, Vanessa's disrespect stopped being subtle. It became operational. One weekend, I stopped by their apartment to drop off a custom oak coffee table I'd spent 3 weeks crafting in my workshop, a housewarming gift. Vanessa opened the door, looked at the table, and then looked at my hands, which had a few trace stains of dark wood finish on the knuckles. She didn't invite me in. She stood in the doorway, pulled a $10 bill from her purse, and held it out to me. "Thanks for bringing it up, Raymond," she said with a sugary smile. "Here, grab yourself a coffee on the way out. Oh, and could you leave the table in the hallway? I'll have Garrett move it inside later. I don't want boot marks on the foyer rug." I looked at the $10 bill. Then I looked at her. I didn't take the money. I set the table down gently in the hallway, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Enjoy the table, Vanessa." When Garrett came over 2 days later, he looked uncomfortable. "Dad, Vanessa felt bad about the other day. She just gets nervous about house cleanliness." "Did she like the table?" I asked softly. Garrett hesitated. "Well, she actually put it in the storage unit downstairs. She said the oak didn't match her minimalist Italian aesthetic." I felt a small cold knot tie itself in my chest. Not because of the wood, furniture is just wood, but because my son was standing there making excuses for a woman who treated his father like a hired delivery boy. Then came Christmas, the breaking point. Vanessa hosted the holiday dinner at their apartment. They lived on the 4th floor of the Alderman building on the east side of town. It was a prime piece of real estate. 6 stories, brick facade, high ceilings, pristine lobbies, gated underground parking. The dining room was set like a glossy home magazine spread. Vanessa's family was there, alongside her cousin Todd, an arrogant young guy who worked in commercial real estate acquisitions. During the main course, Todd started bragging about a new mixed-use development he was pitching in Nashville. "Big money," Todd declared, swirling his red wine. "You gotta know how to leverage real capital if you want to play in the big leagues." Sandra looked across the table at me. "Raymond, what was it you did again before you retired? Handyman work?" "Contracting, mostly," I replied calmly. "Built commercial spaces, residential units. Now I just manage a few properties." Vanessa tilted her head, delivering that razor-sharp smile of hers. "Daddy Ray built small houses his whole life, Mom. Very simple, very honest work. Small scale." She emphasized small. She used honest the way wealthy people use it when they mean unambitious. Todd smirked. "Hey, somebody's got to pour the foundations, right?" Vanessa leaned back, resting her hand on Garrett's arm. "Exactly. Raymond's done remarkably well for what he had to work with. Not everyone is built for the big leagues, Todd, and that's perfectly okay. We can't all own the grid." She looked directly at me when she said it. Not everyone is built for the big leagues. Garrett looked down at his plate. He didn't say a word. He didn't defend the sweat I'd poured into paying for his degree. He just cut his prime rib and swallowed his pride. I picked up my fork and continued eating my dinner. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't drop my napkin. But inside me, a quiet, absolute clarity took root. Because here is the secret I had carried into that apartment. The Alderman building, the 6-story complex with the marble foyer, the building where Vanessa was holding court, the building where she had just declared me unfit for the big leagues, was mine. I had purchased the Alderman building in 2009 during the real estate crash when the previous developer went bankrupt. I paid cash for the distressed note, poured $4,000 into renovations, and placed it under a holding entity named Alderman Properties, LLC. Garrett and Vanessa lived in Unit 4B. Their monthly rent was $1,650. Every single month, that electronic transfer went directly into an account owned by Raymond James Calloway. Vanessa was a woman who prided herself on research, status, and control. But she was so blinded by her own arrogance that she had never once checked county land registry records for the roof over her head. She had assumed I was a nobody, and that assumption was about to collapse on her. The very next morning, I picked up the phone and called my attorney, Franklin Oakes. Franklin has managed my legal affairs for over 20 years. He knows every dollar, every deed, every LLC tied to my name. Franklin, I said, I need to reorganize the asset structure for the Alderman building. I want to pull management oversight back in-house and execute a formal title re-registration. Franklin paused on the line. Raymond, if we update the primary registered entity directly under your personal revocable trust, a formal notice of ownership change will go out to every tenant in the building. I know, I said. Send the notices. 3 days before the ownership notices were scheduled to drop, the main HVAC compressor for the Alderman building failed. The entire building lost air conditioning. Vanessa immediately called me. Raymond, she snapped. The air conditioning in our building is completely out. Garrett said you used to do contracting work. Can you come look at the units? Since you handle small repairs, maybe you can make yourself useful. I was sitting at my desk, looking at the master deed. Vanessa, I said calmly. Commercial HVAC systems on 6-story buildings require industrial contractors. She scoffed. Typical. Always excuses when real work needs to be done. We pay $1,650 a month to live in a luxury building. I'm going to personally track down the owner of Alderman Properties LLC and make sure they compensate us. I took a slow breath. You do that, Vanessa. 2 days later, the official legal notice arrived in her mailbox. It was a standard white envelope addressed to Unit 4B. At the bottom of the document, printed in bold legal black ink, was the mandated disclosure. Principal owner and managing member, Raymond James Calloway. Sole deed holder, Calloway Holdings, Revocable Trust. That evening, Garrett called me. His voice was trembling. Dad, I'm holding a letter from our property management group. It says you own the building. All 64 units. I bought it in 2009, Garrett, I said gently. Your rent goes into an investment trust that will eventually belong to you. As for why I didn't tell you, you never asked, son. You were so busy looking at what I didn't have that you never looked at what I built. I heard Vanessa whisper frantically in the background. Garrett, give me the phone. Is this a joke? Garrett ignored her. Dad, he whispered. How many properties do you have? 7 commercial and residential holdings, Garrett, plus the storage park off Highway 11. A heavy silence followed as 2 years of arrogance collapsed into dust. I'm coming over, Garrett said softly. Garrett arrived 40 minutes later, alone. He sat at my kitchen table, stared into his coffee cup, and said, Dad, I feel disgusted with myself. I let her speak to you like you were nothing. I carried her attitude into this house. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Garrett, I'm not angry with you, but I am disappointed in who you allowed yourself to become. You traded the values your mother and I built into you for a cheap sense of status. A real man doesn't need to bark to prove he's a dog. We sat in that quiet kitchen for hours. Vanessa called 2 days later, her voice frantic, using the word misunderstanding repeatedly. I listened, then said, Vanessa, choices have consequences. You treated a man with dirt on his hands like a peasant, never realizing he built the room you were standing in. Slowly, Garrett came back to himself. 3 months later, sitting on my porch, he looked at me and said, Dad, show me the books. Teach me how to manage the properties the right way. I smiled and opened the door to my study. I've been waiting 3 years for you to ask. Real strength doesn't need a megaphone. Solid structures don't scream for attention. They just stand. My name is Raymond Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and I built everything in silence, including the floor she stood on.